Hello, and welcome back to the Nats Talk podcast. I am your host, Kevin Nibley, and we are sponsored by Old DC Apparel. Head on over to shopoldDC.com for the latest and greatest in DC fan gear. They have a couple new baseball shirts up. Excited about the team being more competitive this year for sure. And the mayor, Miss Bowser herself, is wearing the hat out at public events. So that's pretty cool. ShopOldDC.com for the newest and coolest DC fan gear. And for the podcast, you can find us on YouTube at Nats Talk Podcast. That's also our handle on X. And if you search Nats Talk Podcast, the audio version is on every major podcast platform. And it is worth saying, we don't do this for a living here. I'm a television editor. I make films. I do things like that. I'm not a professional broadcaster. I'm a fan who does this for fun through the Nats Talk website. So if you are able to hit a like button, hit a subscribe button, give us some love, give us 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening to. If you're listening to the audio version, please do that. It helps us out, helps me out, finding time each week to do this show. So we really appreciate that. All right, so very interesting week in Nats baseball since last we spoke. 3-3 homestand, took 2 or 3 from the Diamondbacks, dropped 2 of 3 to the Blue Jays. About par for the course the way the Nats play at home. But obviously the big news of the week was the trade of Curtis Mead to the Red Sox for Connolly early. Seen mixed reaction to the deal. A lot of the national people think that Boston overpaid. A lot of local Nats fans upset that we got rid of Mead. He'd been such a nice find for us this season. From my perspective, though, I feel like we kind of just got our Gio Gonzalez, right? In 2011, we were about a 500-ish team. We finished that season 80-81. That offseason, we go get a young, controllable left-handed pitcher from Oakland, and that guy comes over, and he's part of the top end of our rotation for the next 5-6 years. And I think Connolly early really has the potential to be that guy. Obviously, he's out with a sore elbow, no structural damage. I assume Taboni probably still knows the medical staff in Boston, and he felt comfortable enough with the medicals to do the deal. But, it's a really interesting move for the Nats. You can kind of see them going about rebalancing their roster a little bit. We traded from a position of strength, our hitting, to address a position of weakness, our pitching. I expect them to perhaps do a little bit more of that as we come closer to the trade deadline on Monday. And the only other thing I wanted to get into before I bring in our guest is the Tarps Off kids, man. I was really pro Tarps Off. I was really into them. Loved that young kids were showing energy coming to baseball games. But man, they need a writer. I'm willing to do it. If they can pay my day rate, I'll totally write for them. But it's getting to a point when you go to the game, all they can chant is USA or take it off. Someone get these guys some material, like something, It's sad. They need a full-time writer, someone to give them some more interesting chants. Anyway, that's my little rant on that. Back to the trade deadline, bringing in our guest from last week, continue our conversation with Michael Natelli, aka Stars and Strikes. One thing of note is we did do this conversation before the Mead and early trade, so we don't really get into that, but we do get into all the other potential possibilities out there, and also get into the draft and a lot of the prospects we've just added to the system. So without any further ado, here is part 2 of my conversation with Stars and Strikes, aka Michael Natelli. A lot of Nats fans, myself included, kind of go back to the history of the first time they're competitive. And, I would compare this year to like a 2011 type of situation where they're probably not quite there yet, but you can see how they'll be there pretty soon. And, obviously in that offseason, they went and traded 4 or 5 top prospects to the A's for Gio Gonzalez. I mean, could you see them doing something like that where they bundle a bunch of guys, that maybe
Yeah,
Gaboni isn't as high on that Rizzo had drafted, obviously the dream would be for someone like Mason Miller, like a
sure.
controllable young arm. But I mean, do you see them maybe doing something like that?
Potentially, I think it really depends on, in a weird way, how this deadline goes. Because I think one thing that Paul Taboni probably in his early days as a Nets, not GM, but as the head of baseball operations, gets a bad rap for is I get the sense that people think he wants to be like this prospect hoarder, when in
Hmm.
reality it's he wants to build something that there's just so much ammo that they can go do whatever the heck they want without worrying about sacrificing the long term too. I think when you look at what Boston had done. They built this incredible farm system. They didn't just sit on it, right? They went out and they
Hmm.
got Garrett Crochet,
Yeah.
they got Sonny Gray, they got Wilson Contreras. Like they used that prospect capital, and then they still have more because if you don't know if you've checked their top prospects recently, there's still a lot of really exciting young players there. I think Paul Taboni wants to be in that spot, and I think he wants to be in a spot where, regardless of where the CBA lands, regardless of where ownership lands on spending, it's not an excuse for him, right? He's
Hmm.
he's able to operate like what Milwaukee's done, like what Tampa's done, not because that's the dream or the model, right? They're not aspiring to have a small payroll, but they want to be a team that can be good no matter what.
Hmm.
And I respect that a lot about what they want to do. I think that they look at what Nationals fans have endured since really 2020, although I think fans do tend to forget that in 20 and 21 there was some degree of expectation around being competitive, but
Yeah.
it just didn't work. But regardless, that being said, it's been a long 7 years, and I think if you're the new head of whatever, the sell to fans is I want to make that suffering worth it. I don't want to help you guys go chase one snowball's chance in hell at making the postseason and
Yeah.
then
Yeah. Yeah.
all for what? I think a lot about like the early 2020s White Sox, right? They were this rising
Hmm.
tide of they had, Luis Robert and Eloy Jimenez and Tim Anderson and a lot of guys who I realize now don't sound as exciting as they did at the time, but people forget that these guys are all top five, top 10, top 15 prospects at the time. Dylan Cease was coming, like all these other guys were a thing. And they got pretty aggressive there to go try and chase the playoffs for a few years, and then it just didn't work. And I
Yeah.
think if you're that doesn't mean you shouldn't ever get aggressive, but I think that if you're Paul Taboni, the lesson from teams like that have chased a single shot recklessly is, especially for a team that's gone through what the Nationals have, you want to make sure that when you're firing that shot, it's because you really believe this team's ready to go. And I think that even though the last 4, 6 games went pretty well, I think going back to the Yankees series, you can still see how all the ways that this team is not totally ready yet. And that's not just pitching. I mean, a lot of the reason that these leads got blown is think how many runners they stranded on third with less than 2 outs. That's the
Yeah.
Rocky series that they did that. And the A series, they scored a bajillion and they still left some guys at third. Every single game of the Yankees series, they struggled to hit with scoring runners in scoring
Hmm.
position. They didn't get a hit with runners in scoring position until game three. They consist. I mean, and by the way, going back to that Phillies series, I think we all agree that the bullpen had an inexcusable
Yeah.
performance.
Yeah.
But there was also, I can think of several opportunities they had to extend leads or drive runners in that they just didn't. And boy, are you tempting fate when you do that as consistently as these guys do. Um, you set yourself up for those situations. And with the bullpen you have, you cannot afford to tempt fate that way because it's never going to go your way. And I think we've
Hmm.
consistently seen over the last month it doesn't. It's a both and though. I'm not in any way excusing what has been an astronomically terrible bullpen. It's both. But when you look at this team, they're young, they're very clearly inexperienced. There's a occasional clutch gene, but not one that shows up as much as you'd like it to.
Hmm.
Um, and if you're Paul Taboni, it's understandable why you look at this and go, I don't necessarily believe that that's just going to magically click here over the next 2 months, especially as the pressure only mounts. Um, a lot of the guys who struggle, it's because they press too much already. It's that they swing at things they shouldn't already. It's that they chase way more often than they should. Dalen Lyle comes to mind. Luis Garcia comes to mind. Keibert Ruiz comes to mind. Dylan Cruz comes to mind. Like that's half the lineup I've just listed. And it's guys who do that already in a game against the Colorado Rockies, right? It's,
Yeah.
what's going to happen when you're facing the Braves in September? Like, do you have that in you? And maybe they do. Like, I'm not saying they
Yeah.
don't. Like, don't be bookmarking this for 2 months from now. Going, see, I told you. It's just it's a legitimate question, and it's one that so far they have not answered consistently enough that if you're in charge of running this operation, you feel enough conviction, I think, to go, yeah, this is it. This is the team. Whereas I think you look at 2019, and on some level, the whole MO of that was this team should be better. They were awful, but they shouldn't have
Yeah.
been. They had no business being awful. And in a lot of ways, water was finding its level when they went on that run. right?
No, and,
That
and
was
that team was older too, right? It's like
that's
when you're,
exactly right.
that's the thing. It's like this team stars, you got guys, like CJ James, mid to young 20s, right? Where the Nats team of 2019, I mean, you were kind of riding Scherzer and Strasburg towards, the end of, they weren't exactly like spring chickens there, Kendrick. We had a lot of older players.
This is one of the youngest teams in baseball. That was the oldest team in baseball,
Hmm.
like as a
Yeah.
comparison. And that showed. They had the clutch gene. They handled it. They faced the Cardinals, who were younger in the NLCS, and the Cardinals were scared crapless, and the Nationals weren't. They were ready to roll. Now, obviously, this team's for some reason just a juggernaut on the road, and I don't understand why. But that being said, like they're just not ready for that yet. And I don't think that adding one veteran guy in the clubhouse or two veterans in the clubhouse suddenly does that over the course of 8 weeks. So it's just
Sure.
a really tough thing because you know we haven't had playoff baseball since 2019. We may not have a season next year. It's really hard to be like you're really going to miss out on your one chance. I want to see playoff baseball as much as the next guy. Don't
Yeah.
get me wrong, but I also want all this crap we've gone through for 6 years to be worth it. So it's I don't want them to waste all that on chasing something that may not be there either. It's a really tough call for Paul Taboni, and I'm very glad I'm not GM Michael Natelli because I would not envy being him
Yeah.
right now. It's a really tough needle to thread.
They go 4 games to Atlanta, 4 games to Philly. I mean, to me, when I look at this team and I look at the schedule, that seems like the kind of death, like that could be where the season goes to die. Or, I mean, if you want to be optimistic and feel like this is some 2019 improbable run, that could be maybe where they catch some spark and then get really hot and,
Well,
make
if you want to be
everyone's,
optimistic, it's the fact that these guys become the 1920s Yankees every time they go on the road. It makes no sense.
yeah,
Like
no, yeah,
and then they go home and they look like they did last year, and it makes no sense. It blows my mind because Nationals Park is not inherently a super hitter friendly park or pitcher friendly yard, and yet they crap down their leg every time they're at home, and it doesn't make sense. Um, but I also think that's another example of them being a young team. Is that on the one hand, yeah, getting on the road and performing how they do is like, wow, they're overachieving. On the flip side, when you're at home, there is a basic level set of expectation that you take care of business and essentially almost overperform at home, right? Playing on the road
hmm
is supposed to be harder, even if you're playing a worse team. And yet they can't show that they can take care of business. It's like the runner at third thing. Like there's a
hmm
lot of things like that where, 2019 was special because of how absurd it was. You didn't win a single game at home in the World Series, and you like that's
yeah,
that, that
yeah,
that was on the one hand was incredibly special. On the other hand, had it not worked, that would be incredibly embarrassing. All right, and
yeah.
so there's the other side of that shoe that you're facing now if you're this team, and there's all these things that they're not doing that in some ways make it special because it's working anyway, and yet it also feels like they're due. And I think we've seen over the last 6 years how much luck the Nationals were riding on that because water did find its level, and 2020 went tough, 2021 went tough, and then here we are 6 years later talking about how much we want to get back to that. So you want to be really careful when you're riding waves like that to really pick your shots because sometimes when you're riding the luck that hard, it crashes pretty hard. And I think Paul Taboni's trying to be really careful of that because he's not an idiot. They are very numbers driven. All the numbers tell you that regression is inevitable for this team, and maybe it's not, but they want to be really careful how they handle that, and I can understand why.
No, definitely. Now I wanted to switch gears a little bit
Yeah.
to the draft. Obviously we took local guy Chris Sokopian with our first pick. I mean, what were your thoughts on him? Do you like him as a prospect, and do you feel like he fits some larger Taboni vision of what they're looking for in a bat?
Yeah, I mean, first off, as a Montgomery County guy, that was just super cool. But I think beyond that, yeah, it made a lot of sense. I think Paul Taboni has talked a lot about drafting guys who have the traits that they don't believe they can teach, so that they can teach them the things they think they can.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
Chris Hakopian has just remarkable in zone contact ability. Um, and that's the kind of thing you can't teach. I think it's a polar opposite example from someone like Elijah Green, right? A guy who
Yeah.
he has all the athletic gifting, and
Hmm.
I don't mean to pick on him either, but like, talk about a contrast, right? The guy who has all the natural athletic traits you can't teach versus the kind of guy who has all the baseball traits that you can't teach. They believe that they can help him figure out the power. He already has some power, but help him really figure it out from a big league sense. I think, they can help him figure out the defensive side of things where it's not that he is a bad defender. I think he's just more limited in terms of his range than you'd like from
Hmm.
the average middle infielder. Um, But at the end of the day, what you're looking for if you're Paul Taboni is just stacking guys who you feel pretty good about. And I think that Hakopian fits that, even if he doesn't project as a natural kind of superstar type player.
No, definitely. You mentioned, some questions. Do you think he ends up sticking in the middle infield, or is he going to be a third or potentially one of those guys that they have to move to the outfield? What do you know about his defense and if it can translate to the major league level?
Yeah, it's funny. A guy I actually think a lot about with him is actually a guy like Curtis Mead, right? Like a
Hmm.
guy who maybe not the most rangy, not the best arm strength, but what they've done with Curtis is they've really helped him do the intangible things really well, right? They've helped him get good reads on balls. They've helped him charge balls really well so that when he is throwing the ball, even if his arm isn't great, he's still generally making the throws. Now, Mead's imperfect, and I think that also points out Hakopian's flaws, right? It'd be a similar thing where he's not the most, Nolan Arenado-esque third baseman or, someone like that at second base, but
Hmm.
it's workable. I think that what'll probably dictate his future position ultimately is A, how he takes to that coaching. Not because the makeup is all there. He's the son of a coach. Like I don't worry about him receiving it. It's more how well does that actually show up in the game, though.
Hmm.
Uh, and then I think it's also just going to be a question of what does the major league roster look like if and when he's ready to join it. Because if they have, the next Ryan Zimmerman at third base already, it becomes a lot easier to be like, hey, you're actually going to go to left field. Not to make a really lazy comparison to another former Maryland guy, but actually think of a guy like Matt Shaw, right, who had a very similar experience with the Cubs. Came up as a shortstop. They didn't really know what to do with him. They tried him at second and third, and then ultimately they had guys at both those spots. He ends up in the outfield. Like I think that while we obviously all hope, I think that Hakopian's big league career goes better than Shaw's has. I think that in terms of navigating what to do with him defensively, you're probably going to see something that's pretty similar in terms of his situation will be dictated as much by what his team's roster looks like at the time as it does um, his own actual ability because they do have so many other guys coming with Willits, who seems like a lock to stay at shortstop, but also
Hmm.
several other guys who could play short if for whatever reason, Willits doesn't work out, right? Angel Feliz is an incredibly gifted defender. Coy James is coming. There's so many others behind Devin Fitzgerald, although they look like they've already set him at second base. Seaver King, for that matter, right? There's so many other players, and this is all, by the way, assuming that they don't keep CJ Abrams, like who could also,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Like the CJ of it all is also there. So like, there's just so many other guys that it feels like that's probably going to decide it more than he does. But um, average defender who I think they could help figure some things out. And the fact that Luis Ariz, by the way, is like the top defensive second baseman in baseball makes me have a hard time doubting that anyone can figure it out anymore because he was such
Hmm.
a liability there
Yeah.
as recently as last year that, you know, granted, we don't have Ron Washington coaching our infielders, but it truly is anything's possible with good coaching.
No, definitely. Now, Hakopian signed, about 400 grand under slot. Do you think that played into it at all? The Nats wanted to keep that money for later in the draft.
I think that was definitely a part of it. It seems like they were just objectively pretty high on Hakopian, so I don't think it was a case where they were like having to take a guy they weren't excited about.
Hmm.
But I think it's kind of like what we were talking about with the trade deadline, right? There's with the draft, it's always 20 different things that are all interconnected. It looked like Jared Grinlinger, who we knew they were connected to for months, seemed like he got a pretty nice bag from the Angels, even more than I think most people projected he would sign over slot.
Hmm.
Um, that probably played into things. And I think that was part of why you saw that even up until the day of, like, it seemed like it was a very real discussion of how they were going to go because they were having financial conversations with the representation of both those players and probably a few others as well. Um, so I'm sure that was a part of it, but I also don't think that it was a situation where they didn't get a guy they were really excited about either. Because I don't get the sense that this front office is the type to ever like settle, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They're not gonna punt it, especially a first round pick for a team that lives and breathes the draft. And you read about the way that they built player development plans for over 200 prospects and presented them to them at the
Yeah.
combine. These guys live and breathe this stuff, and so they're not going to waste a first round pick just to save a few hundred grand to
Mhm.
get cute later. Um, so I think it probably played a factor, but not in the sense that they missed out in any way.
They definitely. No, they took some of that money and gave it to Luke Williams over
Yeah.
slot later. What's your take on him?
Yeah, he's a fun one, and I think that the cool thing with how they approach this is that I think, and we started to see this last year too, when it was um the DeBartolo led draft, and all the other guys who were still in that room. By the way, we forget that the scouting director was still there, like all these other
Yeah.
guys are still there, who absolutely deserve credit, although they're no longer here with the team. the Rizzo tendency, and I realize this was not just Mike Rizzo, but it was the guys who advised him as well, Chris Klein and all those others. It tended to be to chase those traits early in the draft, right? And not again, not to pick on Elijah Green, but like really, if there's a perfect example of that, it's a guy like Elijah Green, right? The guy who, if you could coach him up to do everything right, he's Aaron Judge, right?
Yeah.
And to this day, I don't think anyone doubts that. You turn on a Wilmington game and you're like, man, this guy could do. If you turn on one of his good games and he does that every time, you're like, this guy's a top 50 prospect. He's the next Lewis Robert. Like you see it. They did that with a top 10 pick. And I think that what you're seeing with Luke Williams, who, not to compare him to Elijah Green, because I don't think that it's a good comparison, but I mean in the terms of just really betting on athleticism over everything else.
Hmm.
They did that in the third round and they gave him second round money instead of giving him top 10 pick money.
Hmm.
Um, and so to me, it's really exciting both in terms of how they're approaching investing in those types of players. They're doing it, but they're doing it strategically. They're not over investing, married with the fact that this is a player development group that we can actually start to believe in, right? These are the kinds of players that I said it when they picked them. I would have hated this pick 3 years ago, and I love it with this group because it's the type
Hmm.
of group I actually think can get something out of those types of players. Whereas the former, player development regime just had shown absolutely zero track record of that. They took these kinds of guys in the past, right? TJ White was a good example of that, who's starting to figure things out, by the way, at formerly Wilmington and now Harrisburg. Brentner Cox was a good example of that, a guy who prospect people were really excited about when they took him, but it just nothing ever came of that. Christian Vaccaro on the international side was a guy like that, super toolsy. Everyone thought he could be something, and then that just never really came together. Um, I'm really excited to start getting some of those types of players into this system under this regime to see what they can
Hmm.
do with that. Because man, he's such a fun player. He's so quick. He's incredibly athletic. I mean, the first thought I had was like, man, if this guy can, do anything, it's Trey Turner upside. Now, it's easy to pick lofty upside is upside, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
lots of players can have superstar players that you make as like their 100th percentile outcomes, but that's kind of the mold of player that you see if he does hit his 100th percentile outcome.
Yeah.
Uh, which is really fun. It's a very similar style to what we know at shortstop historically as Nationals fans. Um, but that said, there's a reason that a guy like that is also in the third round. He's a lot more raw. He is a high school player, and the hit tool still needs a lot of work, and they need to also help him tap into that power more consistently. So it's going to be a project, and that's why he was a third round pick, not a first round pick. Um, so we'll see. It's definitely one that's worth monitoring. It's not one that I'm like hitching my wagon to him being the future of the franchise or anything
Hmm.
like that. But it's also the kind of thing where if you look up a year or two from now and he's suddenly, one of the fastest rising prospects in baseball, I don't think anyone would be super surprised either. So high variance player, high floor, very low, or no, high ceiling, low
Hmm.
floor, range of outcomes. But really excited to see what the Tabani regime starts to do with some of these guys that they're getting their hands on and that they've picked, by the way, because all the player development wins that we've seen are guys that they did
Yeah.
not intentionally select. And that doesn't mean they're not talented, right? Like I've said for a million years that I think that Mike Rizzo's regime did a really good job finding talent and did a terrible job of doing anything with it. So it's not that there was no talent in the system, as evidenced by the fact that the big league roster is performing pretty well right now.
Yeah.
But
No,
now these are guys that they've picked that fit their model, and they're going to get to actually mold players as they see fit, and that's really exciting to me.
no, definitely. Now that speaking of, kind of the players that like a high upside high school guy. They took Cooper Harris, who's got a ERA under zero point 0.5 in high school,
Yeah.
and then they took a bunch of other arms in the middle rounds. I mean, are there any arms in there that excite you? And do you think they just is this some? I know they say don't draft for need in Major League Baseball, but do you think this was something where they look at our system and they're like, we need a lot more arms, and the draft kind of went that way, or what do you think their thought process was there?
I think it's some of that, but I also think you step back from that a little bit. They also took, four bats in the first five picks. They also took a
Mm,
catcher out of, I think, UCLA, who Joe Doyle, who covers this stuff better than anyone in the business, was talking about looks already defensively like a big league catcher. They should have to help him figure out the bat and all of the adjusting to the big league game. So they did take some bats. They front loaded that portion of it a lot. And so I think some of it was also just balancing that out a little bit. Um, they also, there's not necessarily one name that jumps out to me, but I do like that they seemingly took guys who did one thing very well
mm,
versus just kind of throwing darts at guys who, they do a lot of stuff okay. Like they had a thing that they can do well. And for a guy who's getting picked in the 11th or 12th or 13th round, that's probably your best shot at finding a guy who can at least be an okay big leaguer, right? Go find the
mhm.
guy who just has some crazy changeup, and you can figure out how to make him your fifth bullpen arm. And in the 13th round, that's a win. Like
Yeah.
it's one of those things where again, the casual baseball fanness of it all probably doesn't get as excited about finding your next. Odalis, Odalis Perez or, or
Mhm.
a guy like that. But, you know, from a GM standpoint, if you can keep finding solid relief pitching in the late rounds, that's a win. So I was really excited that they seemingly found guys that they were excited about one thing about. Because
Mhm.
again, this player development group, that's the kind of thing you trust them to be able to stack a few other things on and go find your seventh bullpen arm who has a 4.05 ERA that no one's ever going to be excited about, but it's a heck of a lot better than what we have now. And I think Nationals fans could really appreciate having a team that can churn out guys like that after what we've witnessed over the last few years. So to me, that's the most exciting part of how they approach that.
No, definitely. We're getting close out of time, but if you had to look at the rest of the season, I know obviously you're throwing out a lot of scenarios, but in terms of what the Nats do at the deadline, in terms of how
Yeah.
these last 50 to 60 games go, how do you see this playing out in your crystal ball?
Yeah, I think at a minimum, it feels more likely than not that Foster moves. I think that he's kind of despite what I have over here. And I do think they'll have, to be clear, I do think they'll at least have the conversation with his agent. What's the number? I
Mhm.
don't know how far those talks have gone or will go. I don't expect that it'll be very far, just given all the variables you and I talked about.
Yeah.
I think they will at least check in. Um, if for nothing else to have leverage and train discussions, right? But I think he's also kind of the one where the dam kind of starts to break or not break because I think they are aware of the clubhouse culture and they're not
Mhm.
going to move a guy like Luis Garcia. I don't think if they're not trading Griffin. I think they recognize all those kinds of things. I think Griffin probably moves. And then I think that you definitely see at least someone from that outfield group move. I don't know who it is. It might be Andrew Pinckney, it might be Christian Franklin, it might be Jacob Young, it might be Dalen Lyle. Like it's because I don't think that they're approaching it with a name in mind. I think they just want to deal from depth and deal from
Mhm.
position of strength to address positions of weakness, and they're going to explore all avenues to do that. And then I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, some surprising name moves, whether that's Keibert Ruiz, whether that is Dalen Lyle, one of those guys that we don't necessarily expect, not because it's so crazy and not because they just hate these players, but I think it's more in a buyer's or in a seller's market. You're going to explore all kinds of stuff.
Mhm.
And these guys are ultimately trying to swap out pieces for players that are their guys. And so, I think Spencer Nussbaum did a thing at the Athletic where he did his big bold predictions for the second half. And one of them was that the Nationals lead the trade deadline in deals,
Huh.
right? And
Interesting.
well, he said he clarified that that's not reporting, it's just purely speculation. However, the spirit of it, I think, is really well founded in the sense that there's just a lot of players that are not Taboni regime guys. And so whether that's buying, whether that's selling, it's a really interesting opportunity on both fronts to swap some pieces out, even if it's for equal pieces, more like that Perales and Jake Bennett deal, right? That wasn't a buy move,
Yeah.
that wasn't a sell move. It
Yeah.
wasn't really either. It was kind of both and neither at the same time. I think you could see that with a lot of the guys that we've felt are weirdly stagnant. A lot of fans are wondering why Luke Dickerson hasn't moved up to high A. Maybe he's one they're not that high on. I don't know. Yohani Morales, similar thing. Feels like he should have been in the big leagues by now, but he's not. Is that a guy they look to move? I think you might see some of that regardless of whether they're buying or selling, you know? And it wouldn't surprise me if they are doing both because everything we've read so far, ESPN did their top 50 trade candidates, and the Nationals are listed as fits for Joe Ryan and Reed Detmers, but CJ Abrams is also the ninth guy on the list. So it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
there's this sense that I think they recognize that their window has been moved up, regardless of whether they go for it in 26. And there's no reason not to use this opportunity to keep adding for 27 and beyond, even if that means swapping some stuff out.
Yeah,
So it's gonna be real
it
interesting to
maybe
see.
like a rebalancing of the roster more than necessarily like a hard sell or a hard buy. It's just, kind of
Right, totally
shuffling
independent of
some
what.
cards. Yeah.
That's right, totally independent of what they think is going to happen this year. Right, like I don't think that like if they think they're going to finish 5 games out of the wild card, I don't think that'll stop them from going to get a Reed Detmers if they thought that the price of that was worthwhile. Now, are they going to
Mhm.
do that? I have no idea. My point is more, I don't think that the wild cardness of it all is going to dictate if they at least explore it. Now, they might be a little more willing to pay a premium if they think that they're going to go for it. But I think that they're going to check in on all of that stuff for controllable players, regardless of how aggressive they're looking to be for this year. Um, and it might make fans really confused, right? We might see CJ Abrams traded, and then we might go get Reed Detmers, and people will be like, "What? What are we doing here?" I doubt that both those things exactly happen, but you get my point.
Yeah. Yep.
It might feel like a really confusing deadline for fans, and I can completely appreciate that. But I think that's where that's coming from. Is let's go build for 27 and beyond, and swap out the pieces that we just don't see as part of the big picture here.
No, definitely. So we're about out of time, but please let us know how we can keep up with you on social and anything you want to promote.
Yeah, I think the only thing would be if you want to see me talk as long as I have here, it's on it can be on your timeline every day on X, on Stars and Strikes on Twitter. So
All right, cool. Well, thanks a lot, Mike. Appreciate the time and talk to you soon.
yeah, thanks so much, Kevin.
All right. Thanks again so much to Mike. Really smart baseball guy, really in depth, has a lot of knowledge. One of my favorite follows for sure. So yeah, big series coming up. I'm putting this podcast out actually a day early on Thursday. With this trade deadline going, I want to get it up before something happens that makes everything we talked about sound irrelevant, and also wanted to get it up before the results of this series come in. 4 games in Atlanta, 4 games in Philly. This is going to be a make or break stretch of the season. Jake Irvin's come back. Trevor Williams just came back. Will be interesting to see how the Nats perform. They've been a great team on the road. Like Mike said, the 27 Yankees, when you get them outside of the district, it's going to be an interesting week or so in Nats baseball. And hey, again, I'm here for it. We've been in the desert for a long time with this club. It's really interesting to me. We're at the point now where I notice online, I notice in the chat rooms, people are pissed every time we lose a game. We are now oddly back to the point as a franchise where people are upset when we lose a baseball game. Our fans expect us to win every single time. And that's amazing considering where we were about a year ago. All that being said, please support shopoldDC.com. Please support nats.talkdcsports.com. They keep us coming to you every week. I'm also going to be putting out a bonus episode this week. It's a collaboration I did with a Blue Jays podcast called Blue Jays Avenue Podcast. Look for that. It's kind of a unique little episode where they asked me some questions about the Nats. I asked them some questions about the Blue Jays. We kind of got into both of our seasons and what we expect to happen ahead of the deadline. So please check that out. And hopefully we talk again next week after a really great road trip. And until then, go Nats.